Another lens that we're using these days, and this is a theme that you're going to hear more about in terms of type 1 diabetes research, is staging of type 1 diabetes. Because in fact, there is a progression of type 1 over a person's life. It starts at the very earliest stages where there's a genetic predisposition to the disease. There is still some uncertainty about which environmental trigger is most important. Maybe it's one, maybe it's a number of environmental triggers, but something happens in the environment that triggers a person who's predisposed to type 1 diabetes to develop antibodies against the cells in the pancreas that make insulin. And at some point, those antibodies trigger an immune response which starts to destroy beta cells. And that's what this chart indicates, which is as a person loses beta cells, they're on a path to becoming insulin dependent, to developing what we call today type 1 diabetes. But we know today that people are on a path to developing type 1 that starts years before they're diagnosed at their doctor's office, maybe even for adults who develop the disease decades before. They, at some point, show up at a doctor's office and they become insulin dependent and they have the disease where they have so few beta cells that, in fact, they're not able to make enough insulin or any insulin in most cases to cover the needs of their metabolism. And then if a person lives with the disease for any long period of time, there are those complications that are associated with it. So our goals are different in terms of our research, depending on what stage of a disease someone is at. So for instance, in the early stages of the disease, even before a person might be diagnosed, we can actually find those people now, we can identify them, and through tests we can measure whether or not they are in the early stages of developing the disease. There's an opportunity to prevent the disease. So we're focused on prevention in those stages of type 1 diabetes. In the stage when a person is first in a doctor's office, becomes insulin dependent, we're focused on reversal or remission of those symptoms with a set of therapies that are going to be targeted to do just that. And then for a person who's had the disease or has the disease and has developed some complications, treatments which will help them to live better, well, and safer with the disease are also a focus of our efforts. So these different lenses on the cure and different aspects of the cure that we've talked about so far have some implications for how we think about the cure. While our ultimate goal remains curing type 1 diabetes, to remove it from the lives of our loved ones or ourselves forever and entirely, that remains unchanged. However, JDRF-led research is going to encompass type 1 diabetes at every life stage. So the cure concept is more complex than it seems when you first ask the question, what is a cure? Different people may have different subjective definitions of what it takes to be cured of type 1 diabetes. Treatment and cure therapies may lie upon a continuum in a sense. And for one person, that person may say it's a cure, and for another person, they might say it's an improved treatment. Some cure therapies are acceptable to some people, but not others, in terms of side effect profiles. Different cure therapies will be utilized at different stages of the disease. And one very important point as well is that it's possible, I think, to cure the disease at some stages before it is to cure it at others. For instance, prevention is probably going to be possible and occur before we can actually cure and reverse the autoimmune process and give a person new beta cells in established disease. But that's something that's important to the people who support us. It's important because, in fact, we have a very increased risk of type 1 diabetes for siblings of people who are currently diagnosed. And we do know there is a genetic link and that the children of people with type 1 diabetes are at greater risk. So in fact, prevention is a very important part of what we're doing. And it is a cure for some of our constituency. So let's talk about what's within reach. We've talked about how to define a cure, what are the different aspects of a cure. Let's talk about what JDRF is in a position to accomplish. I believe that through a focused and strategic effort that leverages JDRF's research spending, but just as importantly, our ability to influence others, that in the next 10 to 15 years, there are opportunities to fundamentally transform how people live with type 1 diabetes. And these therapies might be considered cures in the minds of some people. So when I talk about timing, when we talk about 10 to 15 years, JDRF doesn't have a great history in terms of timing. Perhaps because we have been very optimistic. We wanted a cure. We wanted to deliver it to our loved ones. We wanted our children not to have to suffer from this disease. We may have been a little overly ambitious in terms of the goals we set for ourselves. I think we need to be realistic, and I think we need to understand when we say 10 to 15 years, timing, what does that actually mean? And what I mean by timing is when it's available to be prescribed to every patient who can benefit from the therapy. And that means we have to have regulatory authorities who understand the risk and the benefits and the trade-offs between those two. That means that we need to have an industry partner or many industry partners who are committed to scalable delivery of this therapy. That means we need to have public and private reimbursement, which is secured at a level which incentivizes industry to continue to develop better and better therapies, which someday are going to be better and better cures. And we need to have doctors who are equipped and incentivized to support the delivery of these therapies to patients. Because in my mind, it's not about when we test it in a mouse and it works. It's not even about when we test it in a small number of people and it works. It's about when it's available to everybody who needs it to increase their ability to live successfully, well, and safely with this disease, and ultimately not to have to think about the disease ever again. So when we talk about timing, what's required to get there? Partnership, collaboration of a number of different parties. First of all, it starts with the needs of the patient. What we need to do is determine what patients want, what patients are able to accept as a therapy, what they consider a cure. Then we need to have science which supports that. We need to have research which proves in the laboratory that something can work. But finally, we have to have industry. We have to have partners who are going to commercially scale businesses around delivery of these therapies to patients. All three of these are very integral to our efforts in understanding the needs and supporting the efforts of both the scientists and the companies is absolutely crucial to our being able to deliver this value to the patients. So in terms of timeline, what does it take to get there? We, in fact, have today a very established process within companies that goes from the earliest stages of exploratory research through to products which are available on the market. There is a timeline which usually takes between 7 to 14 years, depending on the therapy, when something's new, when it's innovative, when it hasn't been seen before by the FDA, when it's new to patients and doctors, it takes longer rather than shorter. But the good news is that we stand on 40 years of research, which has given us an understanding of this disease, which has given us opportunities to intervene in the progression of the disease and to treat the disease more effectively. So now we're actually in this pipeline. While it seems like a long time, 7 to 14 years, being in the pipeline means that there is light at the end of the tunnel and that we can see, we can draw the lines, connect the dots today from where we are to therapies that are going to reach patients, that progress from the earliest stages of exploratory research to the preclinical stages when you're testing therapies in a mouse, to phase 1 trials, which is the first time you actually test something in a human to make sure it's basically safe. Phase 2 and phase 3 trials, which prove that it's not only safe, but it actually does what you want it to do. Then you get through a regulatory process, you put it on the market, and people are using it. This is the process that we're engaged in. This is the area we're focused today, which is translating from exploratory research through to the patients. When we say from bench to bedside or translational research, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a pipeline, steps moving along the way from the laboratory, things reaching patients.